Welcome to Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our website is libertylawtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links relevant to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@libertylawtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today we are discussing with John McGinnis his new book, Accelerating Democracy, Transforming Governance Through Technology. John McGinnis is the George C. Dix Professor of Constitutional Law at Northwestern University, and he is the co-author with Michael Rappaport of the upcoming book, Originalism and the Good Constitution, that will be published later this year. John, I'm glad to have you.
Glad to be here.
So the book is Accelerating Democracy, and I thought maybe as a lead-in to our discussion, it would be worthwhile for me to read these opening two paragraphs of your book, which I thought are really well done and invite discussion. So let me just read these passages. I want to ask you a quick question, and then I'll let you comment. You say, most of us are caught up in the quickening whirl of technological change. As consumers, we can readily recognize the benefits created by the quicker technological tempo, ever smarter phones, more effective medicines, and faster connections to those around us. We thrive as companies leapfrog one another to create the next new thing. We rarely pause, however, to consider what such technological progression means for our lives as citizens. Yet the central political problem of our time is how to adapt our venerable democracy to the acceleration of the information age. Modern technology creates a supply of new tools for improved governance, but it also creates an urgent demand for putting these tools to use. We need better policies to obtain the benefits of innovation as quickly as possible and to manage the social problems that speedier innovation will inevitably create, from pollution to weapons of mass destruction. So let me ask you, what are the new technologies that you believe can improve democracy?
I think, though, essentially they are technologies that produce better information about the consequences of social policy. I mean better information in two senses. One, better information from the data that's available in the world, but also better information from the different perspectives of citizens, and therefore we can have a more accurate understanding because we have technologies like prediction markets that focus information in a way that's more likely to be accurate than mechanisms we've had before.
So let me kind of just be cute here. So why do we want to accelerate democracy? And let me ask a follow-up question. You use a term in the book that is a part of your argument, consequentialist democracy. What do you mean here?
What I mean here is that I think a part of politics has always been what is going to be the consequences of our policies. We have a lot of arguments about politics, but a lot of times people seem to agree largely on some of the objectives of politics. And there's a debate about the facts. Now, not everyone agrees on the objectives of politics, but democracy forces people to persuade people in the middle, and there is, I think, substantial agreement on some core objectives. Economic growth would be one. Good education for children would be another. And the question is one of instrumental rationality of how do we achieve those policies. And so the book, in some sense, is an attempt to map out a way in which our new technologies can bring these facts more clearly to bear to these essential matters and make politics more evidence-based and more factually rich, and I think allow people to converge, or at least many people to converge, around some of the instruments to meet some of their shared objectives.
Let me ask you a question about these new technologies. I mean, what powers do they possess that we need to incorporate? I mean, do we need to alter the structures of government? Are you arguing something more ancillary here? Could this actually be a replacement of the administrative state? You recall in your book the arguments made by progressives that the administrative state was needed to adjust policy to constantly changing technologies. Is that how you see this technology working? And some examples might help us as well.
Right. I do think that the structure of technology means that some structures of government will be better than other structures of government. I talk a lot about the virtues, for instance, of decentralization and federalism. It's always been an argument for federalism, that it allows different states to experiment, and then we can see the results, or we could have different schools even within a district experimenting. That argument becomes stronger the better we can actually measure those results. And I think anyone who's looked at the way social science is working today has seen the huge rise in empiricism, the huge rise in measurement, and looking at how different policies create different results. I mean, just think about 50 years ago, it would really have been very difficult in any accurate way to try to figure out what policies are going to do, because we didn't have things like large data sets, and we didn't have the computational ability to look at them, to run regression analyses, to try to tease out the difference between causation and correlation. Now, these are not perfect tools, but they're just so much better than they were 50 years ago, and if that's true, there's actually a greater premium on decentralization than there was before. So that's an example of how our technological background may actually make a structure of government better than it was before. And so I'm very sympathetic in this book to the revival of federalism from the Supreme Court, and giving some rationales that I think speak not only to arguments from the original Constitution, but arguments from our current life, that revival makes a lot of sense, because far from being a vestige of our past, it actually is a structure that is well designed to take advantage of the benefits of our current world.
Now, so interesting here. I want to ask a follow-up question that might push that argument. And thinking of something, so a concrete example, a recent policy decision, the Information Payments Advisory Board, I think I've got that right, IPAB, feature of Obamacare, promises, now whether it's accurate or not, I think is an open question. I'm quite skeptical. Promises to be able to cut the prices and the cost of healthcare for older people by collecting a lot of data nationally and then using that to make micro decisions that are more efficient and more effective. And it seems to be it could be predicated on the type of argument you're making about computational innovation and power increasing and allowing us to do more with knowledge, to gather it and then use it effectively. Do we also not actually need a substantial political philosophy as a part of your argument to make it actually pro-liberty or pro-limited government?
Well, I think it is ultimately, I'm very sympathetic to limited government. I'd say two things about how this can get us to limited government. Unlike the Obamacare, one of the things I'm critical in some sense in the book about Obamacare is that it's too centralized, because there's a tremendous advantage in having different states to take different approaches to health care and see what the results are going to be. I think that's just a great mistake. It was, I think, useful. The Massachusetts may have been bad for Massachusetts, but it will be useful for the rest of the country. The difficulty with Obamacare is that it nationalizes this structure. But the question is, as someone who's so sympathetic to limited government, how are we going to get to how are we going to get to limited government? And I think the basic way we can get there is to argue about consequences, is actually to see that more limited state governments, for instance, that states that are more limited in how much money they spend, in structures that constrain the state, do better than other states. So actually, federalism helps us persuade people of the virtues of limited government, particularly because of their feedback effects. People tend to move to states that are doing well. I think we observe in our body politic today that the greatest defense for liberty are these experiments that are going on with Republican governors all across the country who are limiting the power of government or limiting the power of interest groups that grow government, like public sector unions. That's where I think the arguments for limited government will come, not simply from philosophical arguments. Well, these are the best structures in some natural sense, but these are actually the best structures to deliver goods that people want. I think ultimately people came to the view that socialism was a disaster, not from philosophical arguments about socialism, but by the readily apparent facts that it just failed. It just performed so much less well than market-oriented societies did. And my book has a variety of ideas, including prediction markets, to try to accelerate and deepen people's understanding of those facts. And I see this as very much as part of the enterprise of getting to limited government. If we go back to Adam Smith, he doesn't only make arguments, as you might put philosophical arguments or arguments from principle, he actually makes all sorts of observational arguments about how these principles actually make life better for people. And my argument in the book is that we now have techniques that actually make it much easier to accumulate information and evidence and make the kind of anecdotal arguments that someone like Smith makes to make them even more powerful arguments for the smaller state.
So I want to talk about some of the in connected discussion with kind of the particular technologies that you focus on in the book that could forward this process of consequentialist democracy. Let me ask you, prediction markets. So you've mentioned that. So just real briefly, what are they? What do they do? What do they permit us to do that we can't at present do?
Well, prediction markets are something I think people are mostly familiar with in connection with the elections. Elections had prediction markets. People bet on who was going to win the election. And these markets proved extremely accurate. They not only predicted, for instance, the last election uniformly that President Obama would be reelected. The Iowa prediction market predicted the vote share of Governor Romney and President Obama more accurately than did the consensus of polls on Real Clear Politics the day before the election. And that's not surprising, and this goes again back to the virtues of markets that we understand, is it forces people to put their money where their mouth is and accumulates all of this information about what people out there in the world about the best way of predicting some event, in this case, the election of the president. And so that's a tremendously powerful way, I think, to have markets perhaps guide the government rather than the other way around. And I think this again shows how my book is very market-oriented and oriented towards the mechanisms that we have previously seen to promote liberty. So let me give an example of how this could work to help us predict policy. Let's assume that President Obama, back in 2009, he proposed his stimulus package, and you may remember he made all sorts of predictions of how it would decrease unemployment, increase economic growth. But rather than simply rely on those predictions at the time of his administration, we had a market predicting if this bill had passed 10 days before it passed, what would be the unemployment rate, what would be the growth rates, and what if it hadn't passed, what would be the economic growth rates, what would be the unemployment rates. That would help us get some more accurate information about what the consequences of this bill were. And I think this is an example of where at least the claimed effects of his bill were things that I think generally people were sympathetic to then. Lower unemployment, higher economic growth. I don't think there was much disagreement about that. There was, I think, substantial reason to doubt that President Obama's bill would accomplish these things, and this would be a way of actually getting some better information than the kind of spin doctors we see in Washington. Or another way of putting this is that a prediction market creates an army of people who are interested in accuracy. That's sort of the opposite of what most people are interested in Washington.
So are you saying, and I just want to think about the detail of the work, how the prediction market would work in tandem with policy. I mean, and there's a question that you address here, is there's a long-term problem. I mean, we can make predictions on Obamacare, but so many other variables would factor into, did it actually help economic growth? Did it actually improve health outcomes? There's just a lot of variables to take into account there. But also it seems to be there's just the question of, so how do we force people or compel people or persuade people to take these with tremendous value and importance in their political decisions? Or is there some sort of mechanism that you would link it up to the actual workings of government?
Well, I think at least at first, the argument would simply be that people would take into account the results of these prediction markets.
Okay.
And I think that's likely. We've even seen that the election prediction markets, as they seem to be quite accurate, last time they were actually discussed a lot more in 2012 than previously, precisely because they had proved to be more accurate. And one point about these prediction markets is there's a huge problem of difficulty of voters getting information. They're not interested mostly in information, and the virtue of prediction markets is they take all sorts of information and they accumulate it and put it in a relatively easy way for people to understand. And so while in the book I certainly discuss the problems of what is called rational ignorance among voters, I think this is a better way than a lot of the alternatives to cut through the chaff and discussion that often confuses people, to allow them to have the virtues of getting a market price. So that's the advantage of it. Now, you quite point out there are a lot of effects. A lot of things are going to affect the economic growth. But these prediction markets, these conditional markets, the virtue of them is they ask people to predict what's going to happen if a bill passes and what's going to happen if a bill doesn't pass. So it tries to isolate the effects of this particular bill by having these, comparing these matters. For instance, we have actually said markets previously on looking at what's the likely economic growth rate if a certain president's elected, what if a certain president's not elected. That tries to isolate the effects of the president's election on economic growth.
So I want to, and I really thought your discussion of the prediction markets was fascinating. I want to ask you a question. So you note there are limits on the prediction markets working. That's part of your argument is we need to remove those limits and let these things really do their work, do their stuff. Do we have examples in other countries where prediction markets do work in an unfiltered, unregulated way and give voters a lot of feedback and information about policy?
We don't have a lot of examples of that. We have the example of Intrade, a market that actually sadly is just going out of business because of some corporate malfeasance, had nothing to do with the making of markets. We don't have a lot of evidence for that from other markets. We have evidence of it from our own election markets, and one reason is I think that the markets there are thinner than they would be in a state like the United States. Moreover, a large country like the United States And in the book, I also suggest that far from preventing these markets, if they have these tremendous public policy benefits, the government should even consider subsidizing these markets in certain ways to actually encourage people to bet. And the reason for that is, I mean, if one believes that there is a role for government, in other words, the government should create important public goods, information is the master public good, and because we're only going to create good public goods insofar as we understand the policies better. And so this is a completely reasonable place for the government to spend, I think, what would be essentially relatively modest sums to at least experiment with these prediction markets to see if they could help us better predict policy. So even if it were the case that there wouldn't be these markets wouldn't become thick enough, and I don't think that's true, at least about important policies, I think there's even a role for government to subsidize such markets. I make some suggestions about how it could do so in the book, because of their information benefits. Let me just put it another way, I think an economist would put it, is there are just tremendously positive spillovers about having good information about policy. And I think throughout the book, I argue that one area the government I think the government spends much too much on many things. It doesn't actually spend enough money on making government transparent and of creating structures for information. That's actually an important role of government, because I think almost every economist would agree that because of free rider issues, we create less information than would be optimal.
Let me ask you, so I want to try, and you've invited some ideas, some questions I had as I was reading your book with the prediction markets. So I think about your argument for subsidization. So what sort of participation do we get in that instance? Are people going to come to these markets with the right kinds of incentives? That was one question I had for you. Another one is thinking about, and you've kind of mentioned the voter ignorance, and that this would be actually a good way to add some positive light to voter ignorance, because then this would be kind of interesting. You could put your money down, see where you end up, things like that. So this could be a good way to deal with that. And I'm just also thinking, though, these markets, it seems to me these markets, unlike capital markets, we actually want to build on insider trading, on those with insider information. We're really going to depend on those individuals. So in thinking about the voter ignorance problem, could you not get an instance where people actually go into these markets with a lot of information, trying to push, and there are all sorts of cancel out effects, I understand, but they go into these markets willing to lose in order to get a greater gain of the result they want. That was kind of a question. Yeah.
Yeah, I talk about that in the book, and I'm quite skeptical of those kind of arguments. Those are kind of classic arguments that people can manipulate the market, but markets have built-in protections against manipulation. In other words, the more people who actually want to spend money trying to get a result that's inaccurate, they make more money on the table for those who are interested in accuracy.
But it seems the difference would be, in this case, they're subsidized and thinly traded.
Well,
I get that point. I don't disagree with you. I just was thinking about
but the argument is, insofar as people understand that, this is it actually should encourage people to come to the market. In other words, there are all these sheep that are there, and so the wolves are going to gather. So actually, I don't think that's a really substantial danger of these markets. Now, in this entire book, I'm for experiments, and I understand it's possible these markets won't work. I mean, again, you may worry about the same thing in election markets. People worry that people are going to be interested in skewing the market for their candidate to get what's called in political science the bandwagon effect. And we actually observe sometimes in these election markets the market suddenly skewing, but they go back very quickly because, for exactly the reason I suggested, that means that there's a lot of money to be made because things are mispriced. So I don't think this is really a concern. It certainly isn't a concern that should make us make these markets illegal. And some of the subsidization arguments I've made, and you asked me an example of how it might work, one would be just you don't have to pay taxes on your winnings in these markets because they're such a public benefit. I think we'll encourage more people to participate in these bona fide public policy markets and make them thicker.
Okay, that's interesting. I want to ask you a question about technological acceleration. So a large book, an important book, is Tyler Cowen's The Great Stagnation, that argues, really the opposite. At least for the short term, we're really not. He said increasing in technology, increasing in revolutions and gains from information technology. And you argue, your book is really built on the observation that we are. So I wanted to ask you, who's right in this instance, and where, or I should say, why is Tyler Cowen wrong?
Okay, first of all, I think you make an important caveat to Tyler's argument, which is he suggests we might be on a plateau. He doesn't really argue that, at least throughout the long term of human history, there's not been technological acceleration. I think it's very difficult to make that argument. He doesn't try to. I don't think he's right even looked at recently, and I think the reason he's not correct are several. But one reason is I think that our measurements of economic growth do not capture technological innovation. I mean, the tremendous increase in computation and new kinds of devices like cell phones and the internet are very difficult to price. And this, in some sense, is an Austrian economics point. You probably remember that there was a great debate about the socialist calculation controversy, in which whether the government could set prices. Well, it's pretty clear the government can't set prices, doesn't know what those prices are. Well, government sort of comparing the value of one product in one era to another value of product in another area to try to capture inflation, I think has very similar problems. And just to be very concrete about it, the internet, I just think, has just tremendous power to most people's lives, and it's just not well captured in the data. I mean, it's of course it's a entertainment focus, but it's also a way that people get better goods and services, and in choosing them, in a better way they connect to other people. And so I just don't think that's captured. Or to put it another way, one thing that Tyler points out and Peter Thiel points out is, well, we haven't seen huge increases in transportation. And I think that's a mistaken way of understanding what the information revolution. It certainly hasn't propelled us to have planes that go at 10,000 miles an hour. But the point of transportation ultimately is to connect people and things together. And the internet does that in a virtual way without moving us from one place to another. And so I think they just miss these tremendous transformations, which are also missed, I think, often in the price index. So I just think that's not correct. And I would also stress, which I think Tyler is quite open to, is that often exponential growth, we don't notice it until we're in it. And I think one of the interesting facts about the way computers are working is they're not only increasing themselves at an exponential rate. What's occurring is that various other kinds of technologies, like medicine, like energy, they're now being put in the last decade, last 15 years, into the domain of computation. And once they're fully in that domain, they'll partake of the exponential growth of computation. And so computation is not only increasing in its power, it's increasing in its scope.
Something related to your disagreement with Cowan's book is, I thought a really interesting conversation in your book about artificial intelligence and the ways that's going to be, or the way you think it could help support better policy outcomes. I'll just ask you a basic question. I mean, what do you mean? How would that work? Kind of in a similar way to the prediction markets. Is this somehow it allows us to take our preferences, our ideas about politics, and channel them in a much more powerful, efficient way through these various artificial intelligence mechanisms?
Well, again, it's one of the methods, and one way of thinking about my book is it has all sorts of ways of better predicting policy, and artificial intelligence will help us do that in a variety of ways. One way just is to manage the huge amount of data that's out there already. Just to take an example that's not about policy, but to map it onto policy, one of the huge problems the military has now is it's drowning in the data that comes back from drones and other sensors it has. And just to categorize all of that data, it actually needs better machine intelligence. And machine intelligence is something that's on the way, or it's really part of artificial intelligence. And so so it's really just a tool of better managing data and then better seeing patterns in the data that humans might miss. And so that's the way I think it basically will help with policy. I want to be very clear, I generally see these mechanisms as getting better information for us, and then allowing people to use that information, not be controlled by that information, but then to use that information with mechanisms like prediction markets for humans themselves to look at this information, which is now better categorized, there are better hypotheses, and then making their own decisions through prediction markets. So I see it as a tool, not something that is controlling.
So let me ask you, this is kind of a basic question I had throughout the book, and I also, the artificial intelligence chapter, in particular the way you talk about, say bad AI and good AI, because the power of artificial intelligence, which you document, is actually so powerful that it could outstrip human control even, and that would be, or very likely would be, a bad thing. But I want to ask you, how you seem quite confident that we can isolate ideas and ideology by way of superior consequences or our knowledge of better consequences. But it seems to me you can't really do that, that you can't really isolate these value arguments from hard outcomes, that actually it's really the other way around. And an example that kept coming to my mind, living in the state of Indiana, was really intense debate over right to work passage recently in this state, and yet we have so much evidence out there of the good outcomes that it leads to, but yet there was almost and it was almost sufficient to carry the day. It was just a very powerful argument about working class families and stability that are provided by closed shop jobs, and there was soon to be an acknowledgement that more jobs might be created, but we actually want something else. And I guess that just really invites the question of how do you really weigh the results and facts apart from an ideology?
Well, I think sometimes the ideology, certainly you can simply disagree on matters. I don't think that, and what is valuable, and my book, I think, acknowledges that. There are certain kinds of arguments, maybe arguments over abortion, that I think really aren't even going to be much advanced by a better consequentialist democracy. But let me take your example of the right to work laws. The argument is, well, these are going to protect family stability. We see that argument in Europe a lot, that in fact that was the whole ideology of what you might call Catholic social thought in the Mediterranean, that we need these restrictions on the free market to protect family stability. Well, it's turned out, I think, not to be really very powerful argument. It certainly, I don't think, has done much of that. And so I think that is a consequentialist argument that can be evaluated with consequence. Does this actually do it? perform the function that is claimed for it, even at the expense of economic growth or the number of jobs. I think often that it will undermine these consequentialist arguments for various ideologies. It's very hard to have arguments maybe outside of things like abortion. Even abortion has some, I think, consequentialist arguments, but arguments about arguments about education, which is a huge amount of our politics, without claiming that there are going to be some results that are going to be attractive to a broad number of people. And as you know, and I think you suggested with the right to work law, a lot of these arguments are driven by special interest groups. So they need to make an argument with broad consequentialist appeal, even if what they really want is just advantages for themselves. And having a better consequentialist democracy, better ability to predict broad consequences for society, I think helps puncture special interest claims, which I see as the central problem of modern democracies. A lot of people just have to try to think of arguments about how a policy of the state that will clearly help them individually has broad public benefits. They are very creative in coming up with these arguments, but they're often false. And I think it's a very important move for limited government to have a structure of democracy that better punctures those arguments.
I want to ask you a question and a larger follow-up with another larger philosophical question about what limits technology. Given your book's strong statement that this could actually lead democracy into better results, better policy paths, and also, I mean, I guess this is really invited by the artificial intelligence discussion in your book. And I guess I want to ask you about technology and government and the overall structure of government. It seems to me the tradition within Western political philosophy that really leads with liberty is really a tremendous concern about the structure of government and not really being open to a lot of experimentation, that we actually need to get a structure right, and this will allow, and in particularly modern arguments, this will allow for liberty to flourish, for people to pursue various conceptions of the good. But yet also part of modernity are these tremendous technological gains, but also being put to nefarious purposes. I mean, the atomic bomb, I guess, would be the largest example. And so I guess one question is, where does the structure of government fit into your overall, to your larger argument, given the technology part of it? But then also just the question about technology itself and democracy. I mean, what sort of moral, ethical discussion needs to happen as well in your overall argument?
Well, let me talk about the structure of government. This book doesn't say that we should be transforming the structure of government. I think democracy is a very important protection for liberty. I think decentralization is a very important for liberty. Both of those structures, I'm suggesting, our new technologies can promote, because decentralization is a way that we allow to better evaluate policies, and that democracy has an undiscussed, or at least a less discussed than it should be, element of trying to figure out together what actually the results of policy are. So I'm not at all for changing these bedrocks of the protection of liberty
John, hey John, and tell me if I'm wrong, if I misread you here. So I want to just read an excerpt from page 6. This is the reason why I asked you that question, and maybe I misunderstood. So you say on page 6, technology progresses because humans exploit some element of the world, from water and fire to magnetic fields and the quantum movement of atoms. Government structure then also progresses as the new technology is deployed to create better sources of information for its social decision-making, including decisions about problems created by the novel technology. Ultimately, the distinctive forms of government throughout history have been the outgrowth of the human genius for material invention, a social echo of the Promethean capture of some natural element for our collective improvement. I just when I read that, I thought, gosh, where is John going at times? So that's why I asked you that question.
Well, I think it's the case. I mean, that if we look at, and this is really trying to put this in a very long term perspective, it's that let's go back to the founding of our nation. The continental democracy that we have really was only made possible by certain kinds of technology, like the printing press. And this is not a radical idea. Tocqueville said it was absolutely crucial for a democracy of the size of the United States to have things like newspapers that could put similar ideas in the minds of many people simultaneously. If we go back to the founding, the debate, as you were talking about what's the best structure of government, was a debate that was made possible by the printing press and the deliberation that then took place, which was very much about what the consequences of this structure of government would be against the kind of more pure democracy that Athens had, was also a consequentialist debate. So I think we see an example from our own world that the kind of technology that is created limits and empowers certain forms of government. And that's what I'm saying in this book. And it helps us also with problems that the very technology creates. It was necessary to have a more continental democracy, or at least certainly advantageous, because the kind of technology of the time allowed trade, much more far-flung trade than had previously happened, and that was important to have things like a federal government, a continental government. And so, and that's the way that politics proceeds. It proceeds by being transformed by a technological change, and we see examples from our own founding. And today, the argument is we still have we have better information, and we need to use those tools to make our democracy to have better decisions about consequences. Also, partly because we're just going to have many more rapid kinds of change in the future, and therefore we may have some unpredictable dangers that we face. But it's really about using technology to make better social decisions, and that's been going on, I've argued, for thousands of years as our technology improves. And I give that very concrete example of the of our own founding.
I thought maybe we could end. I'm curious to get your thoughts on current policy proposals, discussions, even politicians out there that you find to be related or advancing sort of ideas you make in the book. Is there any sort of concrete detail we can look to in that regard?
Well, I think there's a whole, community in Washington. I think Congressman Issa actually is someone who's very concerned. I mean, not surprisingly, someone who comes from the business world is very concerned about how government can make better decisions based on the facts. I mean, because in businesses, the use of large data to predict what the consequences of some new innovation are, what some new business practice is now is ubiquitous among businesses. And so someone like Congressman Issa, as you know, he's chairman of the House the Government Operations Committee, comes to government and he looks to see that government's not doing that. So he's been very sympathetic to greater transparency, to greater use of empiricism. And my understanding is also quite sympathetic to prediction markets as well. And that's also not surprising coming from someone in business, because we see there's a tremendous advantage in markets at pricing stocks. It'd be sort of rather worrying if all the information we got about pricing stocks came from what various special interests thought the stock price should be. And yet that's essentially what goes on in Washington. Someone says this policy is great, another says this other policy is great because it'll do X, Y, and Z, and yet we don't have many constraints on it. So I tend to think the Congressman Issa is a good example of someone who's likely to be interested in this, people who come from the business world who want to see markets and evidence as a counterweight to the kind of spin and hot air that they see in Washington.
Yeah. Maybe we can. I was reading. We could eliminate the over 60 federal jobs trainings programs that are currently operating. None of which seem to actually place people in jobs. That would be. That would be a good comparison that we could easily make. John McGinnis's book is Accelerating Democracy: Transforming Governance Through Technology. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much.
This is your host, Richard Reinsch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes, and links relevant to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@libertylawtalk.org.